no further ado, let me introduce to you Dr. Bob Holsworth.
Thanks very much, Randy. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Can I be heard back there? Great. Over here? Fabulous. So what I'd like to do today is really talk about the political landscape in Virginia, and then ultimately what that might mean for education, both higher ed and K-12, as we go forward after the election. And so I'm going to begin by moving back a little bit just to talk about the last year's presidential election in 2024, because that'll help us understand the context in Virginia this year in 2025. So obviously in 2024, Donald Trump was able to win the presidency for the second time, and he did so in an interesting way. It was in some ways a very close election. If you look at the actual popular vote, he won by less than 2 points, 1.5 points, but he won fairly substantial electoral college victory because he won the 7 battleground states, and in particular won those blue wall states that were important in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Now, at the same time, he didn't carry Virginia, and part of the reason had to do with that there's been a tremendous shift and realignment in American politics around educational attainment in this sense. So what happened is that Trump has successfully realigned the Republican Party to do better among the working class voters and rural voters than the Republican Party might have done 30, 40 years ago. At the same time, the Democrats do far better with highly educated populations there. So if you look at the states that had the most highly educated populations, and we usually use that by college and post-college, postgraduate attainment, of the 14 states with the highest educational attainment, Kamala Harris won 13 of them, losing only Utah. However, the Democrats had continuing problems with states with large working class voters, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. And what also occurred is that Trump, in this election, expanded his reach among working class voters. He did far better with Latino working class voters than he had previously done there. Now, whether or not that would remain the same for the party, given all the issues with deportation, is an open question. But he did that in the election, and he did somewhat better with working class African American males. There's not too much evidence that there was any significant shift among African American women in the election, but Trump was managed to expand sort of the working class base of the party. But at the same time, as I said, the Democrats did better in these highly educated states. Virginia is one of those highly educated states. Virginia is a state that's about 7th or 8th in educational attainment nationally, and in that way, our results were sort of consistent with what we were seeing around the nation. So Trump, who had lost to Joe Biden by 10 in 2020, he lost to Kamala Harris by 6, and in 2016 he had lost to Hillary Clinton by 5 in Virginia. So it's pretty consistent with what we've seen here in Virginia, that Trump wasn't popular in 2016, wasn't popular in 2020, slightly more popular in 2028, but still not as popular as he was in 2016 in Virginia. So what we saw in this sense was that Virginia was a little bit different than the nation was in terms of the support for Trump. And part of that is sort of the educational attainment. Now, the other thing I would just mention that's of interest to me and maybe of interest to you is that while Virginia still leans Democratic in these presidential elections, it doesn't mean that all of Virginia is Democratic. So if you take a look at Virginia jurisdiction by jurisdiction, because we have a lot of smaller jurisdictions, Trump won, in the Southwest Virginia, won it all. In rural Virginia, except for the South Side counties where you have large African American populations, he won them as well. So if you look at the number of jurisdictions in Virginia, Trump carried far more. He just doesn't win the jurisdictions that you need to win or you need to do well in order to carry Virginia. And I just mention that because it tells us something about school boards as well. That the vast majority of school boards in Virginia are what? They're Republican. Even if Virginia has a state that sort of moves Democratic, the individual school boards reflect that broad sense because they're jurisdiction by jurisdiction. So, like even when Tim Kaine won Virginia against Corey Stewart when he ran for Senate by, double digits, he lost the vast majority of jurisdictions in Virginia. So that kind of makes for local educators an interesting situation sometimes, in that the local jurisdictions are going to be different in terms of the number than the statewide issue. But in any case, so we come to 2025, and so we come to Virginia and New Jersey being the only two states that have gubernatorial elections this year. And so what happens is that these elections eventually look like they are, how would I put it? These elections become the first elections nationally of 2026. That the national media wants to look and get a handle about what's going on. So they're going to be looking at Virginia even more so, I think, than New Jersey, but they'll look at both of them, but particularly Virginia, because we're right next to Washington, and saying, well, what does this mean for the 2026 midterms here on that front? And so we'll have to see what that means. So right now, after this week, we have the tickets for both parties. The Republicans have Lieutenant Governor Winsome Sears, Earl Sears. She's running as the gubernatorial candidate. John Reed, talk show host, running as the Lieutenant Governor candidate. And the incumbent Attorney General, Jason Miyares, running for AG. Democrats have Abigail Spanberger, two-term, or more than two-term, three-term congressperson, running for governor. They have Ghazala Hashmi, a state senator from Chesterfield-Richmond area, RVA, running for lieutenant governor. They have Jay Jones, former delegate, running from Norfolk Hampton area, running for attorney general. And so what can we say about this race, and what can we say about how things look? The challenge right now for Republicans is, more than anything, Donald Trump. For a couple of reasons. First, as I said, this is a state that Trump lost by 6 in 2024. So the Republicans, while the Democrats are talking about flipping the seat because Glenn Youngkin's the governor, the actual challenge for the Republicans is that Donald Trump takes most of the political oxygen up in the country. Every day is about Donald Trump. And this is a state in which he is not that popular. The second challenge that Republicans have this year is that besides Trump himself not being popular, the biggest policy that he had was the reductions in the federal workforce for the first 6 months. You might recall it was Doge, it was Trump, Elon Musk. What state was two states were ground zero for the reductions? They were Maryland and Virginia on that front. So that you have that situation that the Republicans have to overcome as well. How do you do that? And then thirdly, you have the situation where, because Trump has become so powerful inside the Republican Party, has reshaped the Republican Party so strongly, is that it is very difficult for any Republican in Virginia or any Republican nationally to distance themselves from Donald Trump. Like when Glenn Youngkin ran the first time in 2021, when he ran in 2021, he ran as what I call MAGA light. He was for Trump, but it wasn't kind of a bear hug. It wasn't, absolutely, we're joined at the hip. That wasn't quite the case. Now it is. And the challenge for the Republicans there is they have to embrace everything Trump does, not knowing what he will do tomorrow. Is he for tariffs? Great. Is he taking the tariffs off? Fabulous. Is he for deportation? Great. Is he for reducing the federal government, including the place in Richmond? Well, yeah, what did the governor call it? It's a rebalancing. So they have to defend it all on that front, because if they don't, they have a problem. And that problem was evidenced just this year or last year in 2024, when Bob Good, the chairman of the Freedom Caucus, the congressman in the Lynchburg area, the chairman of the most conservative group in the House of Representatives, had dared to say that he thought that Ron DeSantis should be the Republican presidential candidate. And what did the Trump people do? They ran a candidate against the chairman of the most conservative caucus in Congress. They ran John McGuire, and they beat Bob Good. So they sent a message. And the message is that you don't support us, we're going to find a way to take you out on that front. And so that's sort of the challenge that the Republicans have, is that they have a president who's not so popular, but they're joined at the hip to him. How do they get around that challenge? What's the strategy that Republicans have? So let's take a look at that. If you look at it in the past, when I look at how Republicans do well, they've done the best when they come up with a single issue that kind of galvanizes and compels the voters. And I'm going to show my age here for a bit, to go back a little while. It was in 1993 where George Allen said he was going to eliminate parole because we had a liberal, lenient parole policy. He won in a landslide. 4 years later, Jim Gilmore said he was going to get rid of the car tax. No car tax. He won in a landslide. Then you had in 2021, Glenn Youngkin had to win in a state that Trump lost by 10. But what he did very, very skillfully is that he capitalized on the issue that might have cost Trump the election, which was COVID. That what Youngkin realized by 2021 is that parents were sick of trying to become their children's teachers. That people were in a foul mood about COVID. That was just terrible. And basically, Youngkin ran on this Parents Matter ticket slogan. It was fabulous because parents were just in this foul mood. If you're in the Southwest or the South Side where you didn't have internet, you're sending your kids to Wendy's and Hardee's to do their homework so they get Wi-Fi. It was crazy. With the schools closed for 18 months, people were sick of the shutdown on that front. And McAuliffe, of course, in that debate that I was on a panel on in Grundy, made that historic gaffe about he didn't think that parents should have much say about what the students had in school, and that cost them the election there. So the Republicans have to come up well, what's the issue in 2025 that can drive this election? What's the issue for Winsome Sears and the Republicans that can kind of overcome the structural challenge they face in looking at the challenges of Virginia being a state that Trump didn't win, and how do they win it this year? So I'm not sure they have found it yet, but they're seeking it. So the first thing they've sought is that Sears has said, well, we'll finish the no-car tax. So this will be the election what I call no-car tax the sequel. Right? She's hoping that it's, as popular as The Empire Strikes Back. Right? Now, however, it could be Dumb and Dumber 2. That wasn't so popular there. So that's the thing. So in a lot of places, the car tax has gone up since since it was kind of reduced, because the state put a cap on it. Localities keep doing it. Cars gone up. I pay more in car tax today than I did in 1997. It's still an unpopular tax. People hate it. And in fact, if you just move to Virginia, you can't understand it. I thought I paid tax when I bought the car. I have to pay tax every year on the car. It doesn't make any sense to a lot of people. And because it comes up and it's sort of this one-time payment, it's a real pain in the butt to pay the car tax, especially if you're in a jurisdiction that has a fairly high car tax there. It's a problem. So Sears is hoping, well, I can do that, bring that up again, that'll be there. Maybe. I don't think that's a bad idea, but it's a challenge for a couple of reasons. The first reason is simply you have to explain, if you're getting rid of the car tax, what's that going to mean for the other services that localities provide? That if you have to have a plan to find a way to reimburse localities. When Gilmore did it in 97, he said that's the plan. He said, we're going to reimburse localities for the car tax. So, because the genius of the car tax was that Gilmore said he was going to reduce a hated tax that wasn't a state tax, with a local tax. So how do you reduce the local tax? He said, well, the state has enough money, we'll pay it off. Because we were in the middle of the dot-com boom. And he said, we have enough money, we can pay it off. Sears has said, the money's there, but she hasn't had a plan to do it. And the dilemma is that a lot of people don't believe the money's there because they just think that the state is having some challenges because of the federal cutbacks, the economic situation, and the like, that this may not be the time to have the plan. So that's one problem that she'll have to overcome, but she has to have a plan to do it. And secondly, if you don't have that plan and the economy's different, it can be a problem. Because that's what happened to the car tax, to go back again in history, is that for the first couple of years of the Gilmore administration, everything was moving smoothly. He was putting more money in education. He was paying more money for teachers. He was reducing taxes because Virginia had this booming economy. And then the dot-com bubble burst, and in 2001, the legislature said to Gilmore, we can't keep doing this. We have to suspend the car tax relief. And he said, no, you got to keep doing it. And what happened is that Virginia didn't even pass a budget that year, because Gilmore wouldn't pass the budget that the state had. And ultimately, the bad news for Gilmore is it ended his political career. That he never was elected again to anything else. He became an ambassador and whatever, but he wanted to be elected again, and it killed him on that front. And the third point this year is that in 1997, when Gilmore said, I want to reduce the car tax, his opponent, Don Beyer, didn't have an answer. Beyer said, first of all, he said, it's a horrible thing, you can't do it, it's going to ruin everything. It's going to ruin education, going to ruin local government, you can't do it. And then when Beyer thought it was popular, he said, I got my own car tax plan. And it was sort of called car tax light, but he was just sort of going from place to place. Spanberger responded this way to Sears saying she wanted to get rid of the car tax. She said, great. She said, fabulous. She said, I'll be waiting for the Democrats and Republicans to come up with a bipartisan plan, and when they give it to me, I'll reduce it. And so what Spanberger essentially did was that her response, in my mind, was disingenuous and ingenious. It was disingenuous because she has no intention of removing the car tax. Because that's, she's not campaigning on that. She could if she wanted to, because we'll get to her campaign in a moment. She says she's going to reduce costs. That's one way of reducing a cost. I'll get rid of the car tax there. But she has no intention of doing it because she said, I'm waiting for a bipartisan plan. There's no bipartisan plan to get rid of the car tax. The only way there would be a bipartisan plan to get rid of the car tax, the only thing the Democrats would absolutely agree to, because Youngkin wanted to get rid of the car tax and the Democrats said no. The only plan they would agree to would be a whole restructuring of the Virginia tax system, of the income tax system, that would make it more progressive. Maybe a little lower taxes on sort of lower income people and higher income taxes on the wealthiest. That's what the Democrats would agree to. They would agree to a restructuring of the income tax system, and if that provided enough money to reduce the car tax, okay. But Spanberger says, I'm waiting for the bipartisan plan, which will never come. So it's Republicans aren't going to raise taxes on the wealthy. The Democrats are not going to agree to this. It's totally disingenuous. It's ingenious because she says, I'm for it. Right? She kind of takes it off the table. Yeah, give me the plan and I'll sign it. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but give it to me and I'll sign it. So she doesn't put herself in the buyer position of being an absolute opponent. But anyway, so that's one strand that the Republicans have. I think the other issue that they're going to really, really lay into here is, of a three-part issue, is crime. And particularly any crime committed by somebody who is here without legal documentation. Anytime you see particularly a heinous crime in Virginia, and sometimes even the U.S., there's a press release from the governor, from the lieutenant governor, and the attorney general talking about that, talking about the need to really address crime and that the Democrats are not strong enough on crime. Talk about that. Maybe that'll catch on. I'm just not sure that the time today is like the time in the early 1990s when George Allen said he was going to eliminate parole. Like when George Allen said he was going to eliminate parole in the 1990s, what Allen pointed to were the sentences that people were serving for things like rape or murder. And I think even Democrats were shocked that it wasn't that much, that people were getting out of jail in very relatively short periods of time for very heinous violent crimes. I'm not sure that the same situation exists right now, that you have that public that fearful of sort of crime waves addressing middle class. The third point that Sears is going to run on is that she's going to run on Glenn Youngkin's second term. That by and large, what she thinks is that Youngkin, according to most of the polls, still remains relatively popular in Virginia. Approval rating a little over 50%, disapproval 35, 36, 38. And that she's going to try to run like Tim Kaine ran in 2005 as Mark Warner's younger brother. She's going to run largely as Glenn Youngkin's second term on that front there. The Republican ticket, however, has some challenges in my mind, and I'll get to the Democrats in a moment. The first is that they've had a challenge in some ways putting together the ticket. There was no doubt that Sears was going to be the candidate at the top. Jason Mayeres going to be the Attorney General candidate. They're very comfortable with that. But then they had this challenge with Lieutenant Governor candidate. Because what occurred was that they had two candidates originally. They had John Reed, who I've known for about 30 years because he's been in Richmond, a TV personality, and then he's had this conservative talk show, morning talk show, for the last, I think, almost 10 years. And then they had Pat Harity, who was the son, who was supervisor, longtime supervisor in Fairfax County, and son of a very chairman of the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors at one time. And I think, as I look back at this now, that the Youngkin folks wanted Harity because they thought, well, Northern Virginia is a place where we lose. Let's get a supervisor from Northern Virginia. And basically, they preferred him. But he had a very serious heart problem. And it's a legitimate one. It's one that harmed his dad tremendously. It's a genetic one. And he had to drop out. And that left John Reed, the talk show host, as the only candidate. And so what happened with this one is that Reed, who is very conservative, he is, if you want to talk about full MAGA, he's 250% MAGA. He was an election denier. He was all, if you listen to, I'm on his radio show a lot, so I know what he says. And he's a very engaging guy. But what happened, like almost a couple of weeks right after it became evident that he was there was this Christian pastor in Lynchburg who wrote and said, Reed's going to bring the whole ticket down, largely because he is openly gay and is engaged to be married on this front. And what this pastor did is he sent out in this note some pictures, right? And one of the pictures was, or two of them was John Reed at a club in Richmond that's popular show doing drag queen brunches. And they had John stuffing dollar bills in the breast of one of the drag queens, and then a picture of him and his partner surrounded by the drag queens. And they said, this is going to be, this is not going to work in rural Virginia on this front. And then 2 days later, the governor said that on I guess it's called a Tumblr account, or some kind of account that John had 11 years ago, he posted porn, gay porn, not of him, but of other people. And the governor said, he needs to go. John Reed needs to get out of the race on this front there. Reed said, this is ridiculous. He said, it wasn't me. I didn't post this on the Tumblr account. It was somebody going after me. Somebody just made this up, though it raised the question of why would you have made it up 11 years ago on that front. But the reality was a lot of Republicans rebelled against the governor for this. Said, hey, listen, people do what they do. It's not 1981, not 1985. He's a conservative guy. He's totally pro-Trump. Why are we trying to boot him off the ticket? And then, so they went around and they danced around, and Winsome Sears was asked about it, and she said, I'm running my own race. And now finally they've agreed to appear together. It took like a month and a half, where they wouldn't even stand on the same stage together. Now they've decided they better do it on that front. So the Republicans have had this sort of ticket here. And so the issue there is you have Sears, and here's the other thing, who hasn't raised much money by comparison to Spanberger. She's way behind in fundraising. And she basically said, well, that was because I couldn't raise money while the assembly was in town. But she's about $10 million behind right now. That's a lot of money. Reed is going to have a lot of trouble raising money, because even while the governor might say, I support the ticket right now, Republicans are dependent on Governor Youngkin to help raise money. he's not going to raise a lot of money for John Reed. Jason Miyares, in terms of fundraising, he's in the best position of all the Republicans. Because while the Democrats had we'll talk about it in a moment, a nomination battle for Attorney General, the Republicans didn't. Miyares is sitting on $2 or $3 million. So he enters the race with a strong financial advantage, and he's hoping that even if Sears loses, there'll be a ticket splitting and he'll be able to win. So that's kind of where the Republican ticket is right now. I think they haven't quite found the issue. They're looking for one, hoping it's the car tax. Maybe it's something related to crime and deportations and the like. But that's where they are. And hoping that the popularity of Glenn Youngkin can be conveyed to win some Sears. That's where we go. Okay, the Democratic ticket. On the Democratic side, the candidate who won, unopposed, is Abigail Spanberger. And the Democrats are really, at least nationally, and I think in Virginia, pretty happy with her at the top of the ticket. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that Spanberger has won challenging, difficult congressional races in 2 separate congressional districts. She had a district that was centered in Chesterfield, Western Henrico, and some of the rural areas out west toward Charlottesville and up toward Spotsylvania. And she won that ticket. She beat an incumbent, Dave Bratt, held on against Nick Freitas, then her district was reapportioned, and it was taken away from Chesterfield Henrico, put up at Eastern Prince William as the center, and then in some of the rural areas out to the west again, and she won that race again. So for the Democrats' position that here's a candidate who's really battle-tested by compared to Sears. Sears won a lieutenant governor's race, I would say largely on Youngkin's coattails. Previously, she had won 1 delegate race and then ran against Bobby Scott for Congress and got creamed. She does not have that in terms of campaign experience, they're not comparable. That Spanberger has had to run, raise money, and win in very tough competitive districts. So there's a sense that in terms of campaign experience and success, Spanberger has a fairly substantial advantage there on that front. There. The second thing is that Spanberger has that sort of background, CIA background and the like, that they think is probably useful here in Virginia there. So the Democrats have a candidate that they like in that front. For most of the Democrats, think this is a very good candidate. And the second thing is that Spanberger positions herself as kind of a moderate Democrat, a center-left Democrat who can appeal across the aisle. If you look at her ad, she talks about her bipartisanship. She actually was endorsed in her last campaign by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So she does have that kind of backdrop on that front there. And so by and large, the Democrats think she's well positioned for Virginia. She's not, they say, like Zohan Mandami, who just won in New York. Doesn't call herself a socialist. She even voted against Nancy Pelosi. That she has these credentials that they think keep her within the 35-yard lines, maybe, on that front, which they think is good for Virginia. So those are there. And the other thing I would say about Spanberger is that in her campaigns, particularly her first campaign, she was able to organize a real substantial number of volunteers, particularly women, who backed her. And we have that situation where we're going to have clearly a first woman governor in Virginia, either Sears or Spanberger there. But Spanberger has been very good about doing that. In terms of what she's campaigning on, try to explain it in a way. I'll give her positions, and I'll talk a little bit about what I think of it. Her positions are, she says, her big issues are affordability, making Virginia more affordable. She's going to have what she calls strong schools, safe communities, and she's going to deal with the chaos from Washington on that front. You could call this campaign safe and cautious. This is what it is. Because at least up to now, there's not much flesh on those bones. They're themes. But how are they going to make Virginia more affordable? She says she's going to, and I'll give you some of the things that she did. She's going to address red tape in housing, because housing costs are unaffordable. What's the red tape in housing? Anyone know? I do. What? It's local zoning. That puts you in conflict. They've been trying to do this for years. The difficulty is, what do you say about local government's authority over land use? That's part of, when they talk about red tape in housing, that's essentially what they're talking about. Can you put more density into places that may not want it on that front? That's part of the challenge of building more affordable housing, right? That, if you have a community in which the housing cost is this, do they agree to put in affordable housing where the cost of housing is that next door? They don't like to do that typically. Local government's there. So, as I said, it's a big issue, but it's not something that the red tape, I don't know how they're going to, maybe they can deal with it, maybe they can't. I don't know how they're going to deal with that. But that's it. And so her position is always to address the issue, but not to give an answer that could be controversial. Like the guy is Mondami, who won in New York the other day. He said, "Yeah, freeze the rent." Now that's controversial, but people knew what he said something. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to freeze the rent. I'm going to make buses free. That's things are going to be more affordable. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to have the city's going to own grocery stores now, which I think is a crazy idea, but. He went and he did things like that. But Spanberger is not going to do that, because all of those issues are kind of controversial. She's not going to do it. She did vote in Congress for $35 prescription drugs. She says she's going to, deal with health care costs in Virginia. Again, not so easy, but she's going to deal with that. So essentially what she's saying is that she's embracing this issue that's on the top of people's minds. I'm going to make things more affordable, but the steps to do it are kind of a little bit vague, as I said. The same is true about energy. She said, I'm going to make energy costs more affordable. Energy's had a big problem coming in Virginia, because what are we building in Virginia that takes a lot of energy? Data centers, right? How are we going? Right now, we don't have enough energy to power the data centers that are here without buying energy from other states, right? If you're going to have more energy, you're going to need more what? You're going to need more power, right? Dominion Resources said that's what we need. We're going to need to build more power plants, right? The entire Democratic ticket is funded by Clean Virginia, not Dominion, right? An environmental group that says, well, you're going to get that power through solar and wind and the like, but is that going to come quickly enough to power the data centers, and is it going to be as cheap as using natural gas? I don't know on that front, but that's kind of where we are on that sense. So Spanberger, again, she's going to address affordability. Second thing, she's gone strong schools. And I always joke with somebody, like, who wants weak schools? So what do strong schools mean? I think in some ways that you look at it, it means more investment in education. It means greater dollars in that. She's going to address teacher shortages, strong schools, make sure there's enough money in the educational system on that front. And again, I think that's a smart move because people care about affordability in schools. Those are two of the biggest things they care about in Virginia there. But again, what's not being spoken about is how they're going to address the particular challenges that are going to arise immediately with the schools. First one is the one that Randy mentioned before. Where does she stand on the new accountability system? Right? That the one person who voted against it on the Board of Ed was whom? Anyone know? Ann Holton, prominent Democrat, spouse of Tim Kaine, former president of George Mason University, and the like. So this thing is supposed to go supposed to go in right away in there. And here's what I think is going to happen, and maybe I'm wrong on this. But with Glenn Youngkin, you may recall what happened with Glenn Youngkin. What was the first thing that occurred that gave Youngkin the opportunity to have more authority more quickly in education?
School board?
Yeah, the state board. The state board, right? They did not confirm the Youngkin appointees to the state board. So that what happened is that immediately, by July, the whole process was that you were going to the idea was that the state board would be above politics, right? Because the state board would be staggered in 4 years, 4 years, 4 years. So it would take a new governor almost 3 years to get a majority on the board. But Youngkin, they didn't appoint the northern people. Then in July, he appointed his people. And so all of a sudden, he had essentially almost a working majority in 6 months. I can't imagine the Democrats are going to go back on this. The Democrats are not going to do the same thing the Republicans did. I just cannot imagine, and we'll talk about this, that if the Democrats hold the legislature in the House and still have the Senate, they won't do the exact same thing. They're already doing it with higher ed. Youngkin can just forget these appointments he's making now in higher ed. Half or more of them will be gone in January, right? In fact, the Democrats in the special session said, want to get rid of some of them right away. Cuccinelli, you're out. And they're in a court battle now because Youngkin has said, well, you can't do that now. And, they told, they're going to get him out or not. But my guess is that you're going to see some similar things with the state board. So exactly how all of this is going to work out, to me, is up in the air. They may keep part of that accountability system, but the Democrats simply don't like the verbiage at the top of that accountability system. They don't like saying that all these schools are off track. And that's a big difference there, because Sears is defending this, because what Sears has said is that the previous system was, she called it dishonest, that we were being dishonest to parents, that the schools weren't working and we weren't telling them that. Spanberger doesn't want to attack it directly, but wants to say, I'm going to invest in schools and the like. But the first confrontation is going to be about the accountability system and the Board of Ed there. But in the campaign, again, she's going to be at somewhat of a higher level on that front there. So what Spanberger is attempting to say here is that from the Spanberger perspective, this is how the campaign looks. She says, and she says this privately, though she doesn't say this publicly. Publicly, she says, oh, the new poll came out and showed we're tied. She's not campaigning like they're tied. She's campaigning like she's ahead. Now, maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, but she's campaigning like I'm ahead. I got this big financial advantage. People hate Trump in Virginia. This is my election to lose. So what she's not going to do is to take a position that she thinks can lose the election for her. And so that means she's going to stay at this level of talking about issues people care about, but talking at a sufficiently generic basis that she doesn't get into other things. In terms of crime, she says she's for safe communities. I guess, not too many people, maybe some people are for unsafe communities, I don't know, on that front. But that's where she is. She's for safe communities. And maybe that means a little community policing and the like there. What she hasn't done, and we'll have to see if she can get into it, is that she hasn't waded into the deportation debate and the ICE debates that are coming. Because here's kind of an interesting feature. Youngkin, like Republican governors, and Sears are linked to Trump on this, right? And so, whereas Democratic governors don't want ICE in their states, and in many instances Trump's bringing them in order to sort of provoke a confrontation, Youngkin wants them in. Youngkin wants ICE here, wants the deportations, wants that issue arising. And I looked at her website just this morning to see if there's any new comments from Spanberger on it. Nothing. Silence on that issue. Why? And the issue is because the politics seem to be more mixed on that, right? If you ask people, and you look at Trump's numbers, his most popular policy is on border security and reducing the number of people coming across the border without legal documentation. That's popular. And in fact, deportation is relatively popular. The part of it that tends to be less popular is the removal of people who have been here for 10 or 20 years, working, have children here, paying taxes, and the like, so that they are a little less popular. And so where is that going? Because that's becoming an issue. In RVA right now in Chesterfield County, they are picking up people, ICE is picking up people as they come to the courthouse, to sort of move forward their cases on whether they can be here for asylum or whether they have to report, and they've just been removed there. And so that kind of thing is happening in Virginia, right? We have all kinds of agricultural workers, so they are not being as attacked as much in Virginia because we're a red state as they are in a blue state like California. But in any case, that's another place where Spanberger's there. Spanberger's challenge, I think, in this race is two things, and they're kind of connected in some ways. The first is, can she mobilize the Democratic base to get energized to vote? That's been a challenge for the Democrats in recent elections. Can you mobilize the Democratic base? And in particular for Spanberger, it's the African American community in Virginia. because the African American community is the largest base of the Democratic Party, particularly African American women. And Spanberger has had some challenges there. Bobby Scott, for a while, thought of getting into the race there. There have been some issues about whether or not she's that well connected. She's never had to run a race where she was dependent on mobilizing a large segment of African American voters. Sears believes she can cut into that race, cut into the Democratic advantage. Sears is very connected to what I would call conservative African American churches. If you look at her website every day, she has kind of a praise song on the website there, and believes that she might be able to cut into that base. That's, I think, the biggest challenge that Spanberger has. Because what we saw with Youngkin and McAuliffe in 2021, McAuliffe, that Youngkin turned out people in Republican areas at a higher rate than McAuliffe turned out people in Democratic areas. So that's the one challenge for the Democrats. I think Spanberger believes that Trump's going to do the mobilizing for her of the Democratic base. They're going to come out to vote for her just like they came out to vote for Ralph Northam there. So that's kind of where we are on that front. I think Lieutenant Governor, I think, is going to follow whoever wins the governorship. Attorney General, that's sort of an open question. In past years in Virginia, what we've often seen is that there's been historically some split tickets in Virginia. Mark Warner won very easily, but Donald McEachin got creamed by Jerry Kilgore for Attorney General. Jason Miyares is hoping that Virginia split the ticket again. The Democrats think this race is going to be what I call more tribal, that you're going to vote for your political tribe. If you vote for one Democrat, you're going to vote for them all. You vote for one Republican, you're going to vote for them all. And we're going to have to see whether that happens there. So that's where we are. As I said, I think education is really going to get enmeshed in far more detail and far more controversy from day one. I'm seeing that in higher ed tremendously, where the Democratic legislature are just knocking out these Republican appointees. I think we're likely to see that on the Board of Ed. I could be wrong, but I'm not sure the Democrats in the legislature want to deal with the board, regardless of what Spanberger says, wants to deal with the Board of Ed that's there, because they have their own ideas. Clearly, Sears wants more charter schools. She wants more of those opportunity scholarships, that she wants state funds to be able to, that people to use them, to take them to private schools or parochial schools. Spanberger will oppose them. That will be part of the, you're going to see the ads in the campaign. For Sears, it's going to be giving parents more choice. And for Spanberger, it's going to be stopping the gutting of the public school system by the Republicans. I think you're going to see ads that'll be part of this campaign on that issue, particularly there, because that's there. You're also going to see reproductive rights be clear in this election. Spanberger in favor of them, Sears having a very pro-life position, and then there's going to be a lot of issues on gun safety as well, with Spanberger calling for common sense gun reforms or elimination of assault rifles and the like, and Sears having that picture with that AR-47 around her being pro-Second Amendment all the way on that front there. I think that eventually there's going to be some national money come in. The real question is how much national money comes in for Sears. Because at the moment, you're not going to be able to run a race where you're behind if you don't get enough money. Will Youngkin help to bring in national money? Will Trump bring in national money for her? Will Trump do something to try to do that? And the challenge there is Sears, like Bob Good, didn't really want Donald Trump to run again. she's totally MAGA, but she wasn't totally Trump in some fashion. So we'll have to see that. But this is where we are. If I'd have to say right now, you'd have to put Spanberger as the favorite there. The second issue that's very important as well are the House of Delegate races. I'll just very clearly say Democrats have a 51-49 majority here. If they keep that, if they keep this, that means that and Spanberger wins, the Democrats have a trifecta, right? And that will be critically important. And so that could be a source of money for Sears, because the Virginia business community is very worried about what would happen with a Democratic trifecta. They think that might lead to efforts to reduce the right-to-work law. Spanberger says she's in favor of keeping it, but all the lieutenant governor candidates from the Democrats say they want to get rid of it. But in any case, I think what you'll see there is this question of what will happen. The challenge for the Republicans, they only need 1 seat to get even, 2 seats to take it, but that if you look at the last election in 2023 and you look at the close elections, the vast majority of close elections were elections where Republicans won. So what that means is that when you look at the targets for this election, the targets are mostly Democrats have more targets than Republicans. Republicans can target Fagan's seat in Virginia Beach. Might be Josh Thomas and Loudon that they can target. But for the most part, the Democrats have 6, 8, or 9 Republican targets that they're looking at. 3 or 4 in the Richmond area, a couple up in sort of the western part of Northern Virginia, and then a couple in the Tidewater area, and maybe Lily Franklin's trying to beat Chris Head in the Blacksburg area again. And then one down here with Jessica Anderson and Amanda Batten. So the Democrats think they have more targets. So again, if we look at that, we don't know how that's going to turn out, but the initial feeling on all sides is that it would be more difficult for the Republicans to switch, to flip the House, than for the Democrats to gain seats. The idea that Democrats should be able to stay even or maybe even gain a couple of seats in the House. So we'll have to see about how that works out. But that's where we're going to be. And let me just end and take some questions, Randy. But I would say that a lot of people in Virginia say they hate this fact that we have elections every year. We just got over one, we're having one. And I tell people I loved it because it's like the political pundit full employment policy. So I'd love to take some questions or comments if anybody has some.
Bottom line, it's going to be a blowout election.
No, I don't know if it's a blowout, but what I would say is the real question is that does it look like 2017 or not? All right, so in 2017, the Democrats had a very similar candidate in Ralph Northam. Didn't say very much, right? Wore a white jacket. Every time you saw him, he was Dr. Northam, helping kids, had a white jacket, and won in a landslide, won by 8 points. And that ushered in, those 4 years of Trump ushered in the best 4 years for the Democrats in a generation. That they not only did that, but they flipped the House. Democrats hadn't had control of the legislature in both houses since the 1990s. And they were able to do that there. That's the fear that the Republicans have. So the question is, but having said that, let's also look, there are some things that are different a little bit. In terms of the rural areas, they have just become more Republican, right? Like if you live in Southwest Virginia and find a Democrat, tell me. Outside of a college town, in Scott County or something like that, they don't exist there. You look at what I call the Liberty University suburbs, Campbell, Bedford, Amherst, all Republican. and not by a small margin. These are 80%, 85% margins on this front. So the other thing that killed Biden in Virginia and why his numbers went down after 2020 and really hurt McAuliffe was the Afghanistan withdrawal. The debacle in Afghanistan hurt the Democrats in Hampton Roads. So now will the bombing of Iran help the Republicans in Hampton Roads? I don't know on that front. So I'm comfortable saying the Democrats are favorite. I'm not comfortable saying that it's an absolute blowout. I think I want to see more on the money. I want to see more on the issues. And, I know that Spanberger, of the people who are kind of active Democrats, they're all going to vote for Spanberger. Is she going to be powerful enough? And, the Democrat, is she going to be perceived as enough of a fighter that she's going to mobilize people who are these, what I call the intermittent voters right now on that front? That's the challenge. Because I've said if you wanted to come in, if this election was just about somebody coming into this room and giving a speech, of the candidates on the ticket, the two best would be John Reed and Winsome Sears, because they give good speeches. They're the most engaging. They're warmer, and I don't think that matters, but by and large, I think that the one challenge I see Spanberger having is running a campaign that's so safe and so that it becomes complacent on that front. I think Sears has to show that she can be a good candidate statewide, and maybe she can, but I don't know that yet because I haven't seen it there. Other questions or comments there? Yeah, I mean, it's hard to do like a 180. Right. I mean, so you don't want to be perceived as weakening accountability, I think. And I mean, so that's I don't think. I don't think, however, they wouldn't necessarily keep the exact same framework or the exact same verbiage. I don't think they'd want to. The Democrats don't want to say, a third of the schools in Virginia are off track, right? And here's the point: Democrats don't believe that. On that front. So you have these arguments about these tests, about where we really are or where we really are not. And the Democrats don't believe that 1/3 of these, so the Democrats are much more in the line of needs resources, needs improve, that there's something that, we identify places that we can improve. They don't like, they don't like to give Fs. To the school system, and they don't think that's a great idea. Like Youngkin says, well, that's a great idea. It convinces the business community we're serious. The Democrats say, well, what do you mean? Somebody's going to come in and want to come into a school system that's 1/3, they want to put a place in where the school system is, off track. That's just kind of crazy. So that's how I see the Democrats sort of moving this. I don't see them going back terribly on, the notion of better accountability. I see them trying to reframe the system so that it specifies what they want to do rather than stigmatizes a school district. That's I think how they are more likely to do this there. And there are certain things they just want to get rid of. I mean, they don't like the lab schools. For the most part, maybe there's a couple that'll stay, but by and large, they have refused to put the sort of additional funding. They're going to have to deal with that. What do you do about that? Because you're going to have parents who like them in some instances. How do you deal with that? But they don't want to go anywhere near these. I think if anything, they would want to reduce the size of these educational improvement scholarship programs that allow dollars to be put into somewhere else other than the public schools. I mean, I think you would see that too, because, you know, Youngkin's always tried to put more money into that. You know, that there's actually, you know, there's substantial dollars in that program now. And my sense is the Democrats would reduce that as well. So again, I don't see them as coming in and saying, well, we're going to make schools less accountable. I think that they would certainly try to modify the language and then the implications of what happens if you're in this category rather than that category. And that would be something that where you would target resources rather than necessarily just label something off track. I just think that galls the Democrats tremendously to have it that way. Yeah. Well, you know, Spanberger says she's bipartisan, you know, is going to do that and the like. Virginia is probably not as polarized as some places, actually. But having said that, I don't see it stopping in the near future. I really don't. Well, I mean, the difficulty is that you have, it's not just the politicians. It's the entire cultural and media structure that you have. You know, Republicans have a media environment that is extraordinary by comparison to, you know, it's larger than the Democrats' media environment. It's fairly successful. You know, it used to be you might get what I would call different takes on the same facts. Now, if you watched Fox and MSNBC most nights, the factual stuff, they don't cover the same news. You know, you know, something's covered here, it's not covered there. You know, that what you even see about now is very, very different. And it's impacted all kinds of places in life that you might not have imagined at one time. You know, I joke that, you know, that people now have a very clear sense of who they'd like their children to marry. You know, they don't like people marrying people out of their party on that front, you know. I think I was joking once. I said that I was looking at the data. I said more Republicans today support gay marriage than they do having their child marry a Democrat on this. So, I mean, this is the situation. So the polarization has become substantial. You know, people talk about this. I don't want to have Thanksgiving dinner with my family. You know, is a mess. You know, it's just it's just remarkable how that is. So maybe that'll change at some point, but at least at the moment, it's not. And it's a bad thing. It's a bad thing for the society, but that's where we are. You know, people in my business often talk about, do you live in a Cracker Barrel county or a Whole Foods county? You know, on that front, that, you know, where do you live? Yes? No, I don't think she can distance herself from Trump. I mean, I think she's basically, you know, on the big things in Virginia, she's not. You know, she has said, for example, on the Doge cuts, she said, well, everybody loses their job at some point in life. You know, what's the huge deal with this on that front? Deportation, very much with him on crime. So, you know, I don't see her trying to do that. But what I do see her trying to do is to use the connections she has in what I would call the conservative side of the African American community, that's socially conservative. African Americans are a little less supportive of abortion rights than white liberals are. They are a little more supportive of gun rights than white liberals might be on this front. They are a little more religious than white liberals are on that front. And so I think that's part of where she's trying, where she thinks that she might go, and that the polls aren't capturing it, and but that exists. I don't know whether that's the case or not, but that's how I see her. I see her thinking, I have this way to cut into the support, particularly because Spanberger doesn't have a long history with African American voters in the Democratic Party. And I think what her sense is, I'm going to get a hearing here because of that. It's not like she ran once against Bobby Scott for a congressional and got creamed, but that's Bobby Scott. That's not Abigail Spanberger. And so that's what I think she's hoping, that there's this way to do what Trump did by, but Trump was mostly with African American men, but he was able to kind of bump that up a little bit. And I think that's what she's saying. If I can bump it up a little bit, I'm going to be very competitive in this race on that front there. Yeah. Thanks very much.